What if the dog you lost years ago came racing back into your life, right as a deadly storm hit, and only you could save him? In rural Oregon, Evelyn Carter braved black ice, darkness, and her own aching heart to rescue a battered German Shepherd, her Max, when the world had already given up hope. If stories of second chances move you, please like this video and subscribe for more heartwarming animal stories that prove some bonds never break. The wind shrieked through the tall Douglas firs as darkness fell over rural Oregon, snow whirling like shards of glass across the old town's only animal shelter. Every window glowed dim in the gathering storm, electricity stuttering, shadows flickering across the linoleum floors inside. Outside, the parking lot was a treacherous sheet of black ice, the type that looked like water but would drop you flat in a heartbeat. It was the kind of winter evening that made people and animals desperate for warmth and safety. Inside the shelter, chaos reigned. Dogs barked, some frantic, some mournful, their howls echoing against the cinder-block walls. Volunteers hurried from kennel to kennel, hands trembling as they checked locks and shoveled grit at each threshold. Somewhere, a generator sputtered, threatening to die. The director barked orders, her voice barely carrying over the cacophony, while another volunteer wept softly, overwhelmed. In the middle of the confusion, Evelyn Carter moved with purpose, her steps careful but determined. 65 years old, with cropped gray hair poking from beneath a knit cap, she was bundled in an old Army-issue parka, a veteran's badge pinned to her collar. Evelyn's body was slower these days, her heart not what it used to be. But her spirit was still tough as boot leather. After all, she'd been through wars, loss, grief, and more winters than she cared to count. Tonight, though, something was different. Something felt urgent and personal. She had come to the shelter, as she did every Friday, to help walk the older dogs before closing. But as soon as she stepped inside, she felt the tension. The power threatened to cut out. The wind rattled the door, and above it all, there was a sound. One voice, high and desperate, that cut through the others. She recognized the deep, panicked barking from the far end of the kennels. Evelyn pushed through the tangle of volunteers and crates, slipping once as her boots slid on the melting ice by the door. "Hold up," someone called, but she didn't stop. The barking was getting wilder, more urgent, echoing off the metal cages. She reached the last row of kennels. There, pressed against the chain-link door, was a battered German Shepherd, big and rangy, with a coat thick as a wolf's and eyes that flashed with a wild fear. The tag read Max, but the dog seemed beyond names now. He was pure panic, throwing himself at the bars, claws scraping, foam flecking his muzzle. Lightning flickered through the storm, illuminating a streak of old scars along his flank. "Easy, buddy, easy," Evelyn murmured, kneeling beside the kennel even as her knees protested. "It's all right. You're not alone." She fumbled for the latch, hands clumsy in her thick gloves. When the lights died, everything plunged into blackness but for the lightning outside. Someone yelled behind her, a flash of panic. "The door! Watch the dogs!" In the sudden dark, there was a crash. The door to Max's kennel buckled open. Whether from the storm, a faulty latch, or sheer force, Evelyn couldn't tell. Max bolted out, his massive body slamming into her as he made for the exit. Evelyn staggered backward, arms pinwheeling for balance. Her feet hit a patch of ice and she went down hard, her breath rushing out in a pained gasp as the world spun. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Evelyn lay sprawled on the icy concrete, pain radiating through her hip, the metallic taste of fear on her tongue. Around her, volunteers shouted, scrambling to catch the fleeing dog. But Max was already through the door, a streak of black and tan vanishing into the swirling white storm. The wind slammed the door shut behind him, rattling the glass. Evelyn forced herself to sit up, every joint protesting. She looked through the window and saw Max, briefly illuminated by the headlights of a car pulling in, his body tense, his breath steaming in the cold. Then, as if compelled, he glanced back. Their eyes met through the falling snow. Evelyn's wide with shock and worry, Max's full of terror and, was it recognition? For a heartbeat, the years seemed to fall away, and Evelyn saw not just a stray, but the dog she'd loved and lost, the one who had vanished during that awful time, long ago, when everything in her life had collapsed. The memory hit her like a blow. The accident, the hospital, coming home to find the house empty and Max gone. She had searched for him for weeks, scouring forests and shelters, her grief for her husband and the dog twining together until she could hardly breathe. She'd never really forgiven herself for losing him. Now, in the middle of a winter storm, fate had brought him back to her. And he was running again, running for his life, out into a night that could kill him. Evelyn's breath caught. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the ache in her hip, grabbing a flashlight from the nearest shelf. "I'm going after him," she shouted to the stunned volunteers. "Call animal control, call the police, just keep looking." "Evelyn, wait," someone pleaded, but she was already pushing through the doors, the cold slamming into her lungs. The flashlight beam danced wildly as she staggered across the slick parking lot, boots sliding, heart hammering with fear and determination. In the distance, she could just make out Max's shape, a shadow moving fast, swallowed by darkness and snow. The world shrank to a tunnel of light, the sounds of the shelter fading behind her. Only the storm, the wind, and the desperate hope burning in her chest remained. She pressed on, teeth gritted, every step a battle between fear and faith. Because some bonds, no matter how battered by time or pain, refused to break. And tonight, as winter howled and the darkness closed in, Evelyn Carter was determined not to lose Max again. Evelyn didn't feel the cold at first. Adrenaline and pure panic pushed her forward, each breath biting at her lungs as she hurried down the snow-slick street. The flashlight beam bounced ahead of her, carving ragged circles through the storm, her eyes desperately searching for any sign of movement. A flash of a tail, paw prints in the slush, a shape darting between parked cars. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard tires screech and a horn blare. She froze, terror spiking, afraid she'd see Max sprawled beneath a car's headlights. But there was nothing, just a pair of frightened raccoons scurrying into the bushes. Evelyn's heart thundered, the pain in her chest flaring up, but she refused to stop. She couldn't. She gripped her flashlight tighter, forcing herself forward, the memory of Max's gaze burning in her mind. She called his name, half choked by the icy wind. "Max! Max! It's me! Come back!" Her voice was snatched away by the gusts, but she didn't care. She followed the fresh paw prints up the block, her boots slipping and sliding. Each step reminded her of her age, of the ache in her knees, the old wound in her heart that had never truly healed. Still, she pressed on. Suddenly, up ahead, she caught a glimpse of movement. A large dog darting across the intersection, nearly colliding with a delivery van that braked just in time. "Watch out!" the driver yelled out his window, but the words faded as Max veered off, vanishing into the maze of the city's underbelly. Evelyn cursed under her breath. She knew this neighborhood, the winding back alleys, the abandoned lots, the crumbling highway overpass that cut through town like a scar. She'd volunteered here for years, walking dogs, coaxing out strays, patching up battered animals. But never had she felt this vulnerable, this exposed. The wind howled, and she stumbled on, following Max's tracks toward the concrete pillars looming in the darkness. As she reached the overpass, the noise changed. A new, ugly sound cut through the air. Low, guttural growls echoed beneath the bridge, punctuated by barks sharp with threat. Evelyn's heart hammered harder, and she hesitated, fear prickling her skin. She edged closer, shining her light beneath the bridge. There, cornered against the cold concrete, was Max. Tail down, body tense, his fur bristling with fear and fury. Surrounding him were 3 stray dogs, big mutts with matted coats and hungry eyes. They circled Max, their postures tense and aggressive, hackles raised, snapping at him, desperate and feral. "Hey!" Evelyn shouted, her voice trembling as she forced herself forward, waving her flashlight. "Get away! Go on, get!" She hurled a chunk of rock at the nearest dog. It missed, but the dog flinched, baring its teeth at her. Max's eyes locked on Evelyn just for a second. That old flicker of recognition, pain and longing was there, and it gave her the courage to step forward again, brandishing her flashlight as if it could ward off wolves. "You leave him alone," she shouted, louder this time, ignoring the burn in her chest. But the stray dogs weren't easily intimidated. One lunged at Max, who twisted aside, snapping defensively, but he was outnumbered. Evelyn's body moved before her brain could catch up. She shoved herself between the pack and Max, her arms spread wide. "Back off!" Go on, get! One of the strays growled, teeth gleaming in the thin beam of the flashlight, and Evelyn's heart stuttered. The cold was biting now, pain shooting down her left arm, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Max, sensing her distress, bared his teeth and let out a furious bark, standing between her and the strays. It was chaos, a storm of teeth and snarls, Evelyn trying to shield Max, Max trying to shield her. She could smell the rank, unwashed fur, the coppery tang of blood from someone's torn ear. Her vision swam. She thought she might collapse right there, be trampled or bitten. But she couldn't let Max down. Not again. Suddenly, one of the strays lunged for Evelyn's leg. Max threw himself forward, body slamming the attacker aside with a force she'd forgotten he possessed. There was a wild flurry, dogs yelping, snapping, claws skittering on frozen asphalt. Max held his ground, barking with a deep, fierce authority that finally sent the strays backing off, tails low. They slunk away into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as they'd come. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't move. Her legs felt numb, her chest burning as she leaned against the cold concrete, gasping for breath. Max whined and nudged her hand, his fur damp and sticky with another dog's blood, his sides heaving. Evelyn wrapped her trembling arms around his neck, burying her face in his ruff. The world came back slowly, the sound of sirens approaching, the flash of blue and red lights washing over the icy street. Someone was shouting her name. She looked up to see 2 police officers and an animal control worker running toward her, their faces wide with relief and shock. They helped her to her feet, bundling her into a warm blanket, guiding her and Max to the waiting van. "We saw it all," a breathless teenager called from the sidewalk, holding up her phone. "It's already on the news. You saved him. You both saved each other." Evelyn could barely process it all. As she looked at Max, battered but alive, she felt tears sting her eyes. He pressed his head into her side, trembling, as if afraid she'd vanish. In that moment, it didn't matter who was rescuing whom. They were together, and they had survived. By the time they arrived back at the shelter, the storm was easing, but both Evelyn and Max were changed. Traumatized, yes, but somehow stronger for having found each other again in the teeth of winter. And outside, the world was already watching, their story traveling faster than the wind. Days blurred together as the aftermath of that stormy night unfolded. For Evelyn Carter, it was as if she'd been cast adrift, her world narrowed to the sterile, humming halls of the rehabilitation center. The pain in her hip was persistent, but it was the ache in her chest, the kind that no medication could ease, that gnawed at her most. Her room was small, filled with the scent of antiseptic and fading flowers brought by the shelter staff. Outside the window, winter pressed on, gray and relentless, the kind of cold that seeps into bones and lingers in the heart. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, making quiet small talk, but it all seemed distant. Every evening, Evelyn traced the rim of her coffee mug, staring at the pale light filtering through the blinds, haunted by memories of Max, by the terror and loyalty in his eyes as he stood beside her under that overpass, and the old grief that had returned with him. It was guilt that kept her awake at night. Guilt for slipping, for letting Max escape in the first place, for being too old, too fragile, for failing the people and the dog she loved. Sometimes she drifted into shallow sleep, only to wake with her late husband's name on her lips. She'd reach for the phone, then hesitate, remembering there was no one left to call who truly understood. Her son Brian called often, his voice full of worry but always a little distant, like he was speaking from another world. And he wanted her to move in with him, to let someone else take care of her. Evelyn always said no, not yet, not while there were still things she needed to fix. She thought constantly about Max. The shelter director, Dr. Mariah Lee, sent updates. "He's safe, but he won't eat much," she'd said during one call. "He sits by the window watching for you. He howls every night." Evelyn pressed the phone tight to her ear, closing her eyes, feeling the sorrow of that distance as a physical thing. She knew what it was like to stare out a window, longing for someone lost. In the quiet hours, Evelyn remembered the first time she'd found Max years ago, a trembling puppy dumped in a roadside ditch, ribs showing through muddy fur. She'd taken him in, cleaned him up, watched as trust slowly replaced terror in his golden eyes. Losing him after her husband's death had nearly broken her, but she'd forced herself to believe he was out there somewhere, surviving, even if it wasn't with her. Now that he was back, after all that time, the thought that she might lose him again was almost too much to bear. Across town, Max struggled with his own ghosts. The shelter's isolation ward was warm enough, but it smelled of bleach and fear. Every morning, staff found him curled beside the window, nose pressed against the glass, waiting. He refused most food, ignoring the treats they slid into his run, whining low and mournfully at night. Other dogs barked. Staff moved about with kind voices, but Max was unreachable. His body was healing, scabs shrinking, fur slowly regaining its shine. But his spirit was fragile, stretched thin by too many losses. Volunteers tried everything. One read stories to him in a gentle, rhythmic voice. Another played soft country music on her phone, hoping he'd relax. But Max just stared, hollow-eyed, at the door. Sometimes, when the wind rose, he'd pace in circles, tail down, nose twitching, as if searching for Evelyn's scent. The staff recorded videos, hoping that seeing her face might coax him back to life, but Max would only perk up at her voice before turning away, desolate. It was clear to everyone. He was waiting for the woman who had saved him twice. The community watched from a distance. News of the rescue had spread quickly. Cell phone footage of Evelyn facing down the strays had gone viral, picked up by local media. People sent cards and letters, some addressed simply to the lady and her dog, Oregon. The shelter's social media filled with messages, well wishes, offers to foster, donations in Max's name. But none of it could fill the emptiness that lingered in both Evelyn and Max, separated by glass and circumstance. Back in the rehab center, Evelyn found herself talking to her husband in the quiet of the night, whispering confessions into the darkness. "I'm tired, Bill," she'd say, voice trembling. "I know you'd tell me to rest, to let others help, but I can't. Not yet. He needs me. I need him." Sometimes she cried, letting years of pent-up sorrow finally escape. But more often, she just sat in silence, willing herself not to give in to despair. Her determination became her anchor. Each day, Evelyn forced herself through the pain, doing the exercises the therapist demanded, taking slow laps down the hall with her walker, refusing to let her heart condition become an excuse. "I have to get back to him," she'd tell the nurses, her tone brooking no argument. Some days the staff would find her dozing in a chair by the window, a photo of Max clutched in her hand, lips moving in a silent promise. Max, for his part, never gave up hope. Even as the days stretched on, his vigil never faltered. The shelter staff watched in awe, this battered dog, so loyal, so stubborn, refusing to give up on the person who had always believed in him. And somewhere, deep in the quiet, an unspoken bond, older than grief, stronger than fear, kept them tethered across the miles. In the end, it was this stubborn hope that kept both Evelyn and Max going, pulling them through the pain and loneliness, holding fast against the winter cold. Two souls adrift, longing for home, healing in parallel, waiting for the day when they could be whole again. It was the second Thursday after the storm when the phone call came, a voice Evelyn had come to trust through updates and kind reassurances. Dr. Mariah Lee, the shelter director, sounded more hopeful than usual. "Evelyn, I have some good news," she began, her tone careful but warm. "We're going to try something. It's not permanent, but Max needs you, and I think you need him." Evelyn sat upright in her hospital bed, fingers gripping the edge of her blanket. "What do you mean?" "A trial, Foster, just for a while. We'll send a volunteer to help, and your son has already said he'll check in. It's not official, yet. But you'll both heal better together." Evelyn closed her eyes, relief washing over her in a rush so strong it brought tears. "Thank you, Dr. Lee. You don't know what this means to me." "Oh, I think I do," Mariah replied softly. "And I believe Max does too." 3 days later, the sky was a soft, tentative blue when Max returned to Evelyn. The transfer was gentle and cautious. Brian stood nearby, arms folded, his face tense with worry, but unable to mask his own relief when he saw the way his mother lit up as the volunteers guided Max out of the car. Max hesitated at the edge of the walkway, his tail tucked, gaze darting from the house to the people and back to the familiar woman in the doorway. Evelyn stood with her walker, heart hammering in her chest, tears streaking down her face. "Hey, old boy, you remember me, don't you?" He crept closer, step by step, nose twitching, and when he reached her side, Evelyn knelt despite the pain, arms open wide. Max paused, uncertain, then pressed his forehead into her shoulder, letting out a low, shuddering sigh as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Brian wiped his eyes. Mariah smiled and gave a subtle nod to the volunteer. No one said a word for a moment. There was no need. The scene spoke for itself. Inside, the routine was slow and deliberate. Max paced the rooms for hours, nose to the floor, tail wagging cautiously. He sniffed every corner, checked every door, circled the living room over and over, as if mapping the place to his memory again. Evelyn let him roam, trailing after him as best she could, softly narrating the little details of the home, where his old bed used to be, the cupboard where the treats were kept, the spot under the window where he once lay on sunny afternoons. Max slept little the first 2 nights. He'd wander into Evelyn's bedroom, circle restlessly, then retreat to the hallway and sigh, keeping one ear tuned to her slow, even breathing. If she stirred or coughed, he was there in an instant, nose pressed to her hand, making sure she was all right. Evelyn tried to return to a gentle routine, meals at the kitchen table, brief walks in the backyard when the weather allowed, soft music in the afternoons. She read aloud, her voice cracked but steady, old novels, stories of courage and adventure, some letters from friends she'd saved for years. Max would listen at a distance, ears twitching, sometimes laying his head on his paws, other times inching closer until he could rest his chin on her foot. The house changed too. Where it had been silent and heavy, there was now the steady sound of dog tags clinking against the floor, the gentle thump of Max's tail against the chair legs, the creak of the back door as Evelyn shuffled outside to fill the bird feeder with him trotting at her side. The sun seemed brighter those days, or perhaps it was just that Evelyn noticed it again. Trust, though, did not return all at once. Max startled at loud noises, a dropped mug, a knock at the door, his body tensing, eyes wild with old memories. Sometimes he'd flinch if a shadow passed too quickly or a sudden gust rattled the window. Evelyn gave him space, never forcing contact, always letting him come to her on his own terms. Each day brought tiny victories. On the 3rd afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the windows, Evelyn settled into her old armchair with a book. Max circled 3 times and then, for the first time, climbed onto the rug beside her, laying his head, heavy and warm, in her lap. Evelyn's hands shook as she stroked his fur. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she smiled through them, murmuring, "That's it, my boy. We're getting there, aren't we?" Later that night, Brian stopped by with groceries. He found his mother asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked around her shoulders, and Max sprawled at her feet, one paw gently resting against her slipper. Brian snapped a picture, sending it to Dr. Lee with a quiet caption, "Progress." Not every moment was peaceful. Sometimes Max's nightmares returned. He'd whimper and twitch in his sleep, legs running against the air, eyes flickering beneath closed lids. Evelyn would wake, kneel beside him, and speak softly until his breathing steadied again. "You're safe now, Max. I promise. We're home." With each passing day, trust and love, so long buried beneath fear and pain, slowly resurfaced. The scars were still there, on both of them, but where there had once been emptiness, something new began to grow. Healing, Evelyn realized, didn't mean erasing the past. It meant carrying it together, turning sorrow into something gentle and bright. As winter thawed, Evelyn and Max found comfort in their fragile new rhythm. The garden began to bloom, crocuses pushing through the mud, birds returning to the feeder. Sometimes neighbors would wave from the sidewalk, calling out encouragement, dropping off treats or warm soup at the door. The world, which had once felt cold and vast, now seemed just a little more welcoming. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with golden light, Max climbed onto the couch beside Evelyn and rested his head in her lap again. She stroked his ears, whispering a promise she intended to keep. "You're home for as long as I am, old friend. We're not letting go this time." For the first time in a long while, Evelyn felt something like hope stirring deep in her chest, a quiet certainty that together they might just find their way forward. Spring had barely softened winter's grip when the next crisis struck. The air felt unsettled, humid and thick, with distant thunder rolling over the mountains. Evelyn glanced anxiously at the sky as she let Max out into the yard for his evening walk. The clouds were bruised and heavy, tinged with the same greenish hue she'd learned to fear during her years as an army nurse in tornado country. Max moved with a quiet energy, nose to the ground, ears pricked for every distant rumble. He'd grown more confident these past weeks, but Evelyn still watched him closely, always alert for that old flash of panic. Now he seemed more restless than ever, circling the yard, glancing back at the house, as if sensing something she could not. Evelyn finished filling the bird feeder and turned back toward the porch just as the wind picked up, swirling dead leaves in frantic spirals. Far off, a siren began to wail, a long, keening note that sent a chill through her bones. She felt the first fat drops of rain splash against her cheeks as she hurried inside, Max at her heels. She barely had time to lock the door before the rain came in earnest, battering the windows, drowning out the sound of the television in the living room. The power flickered, then steadied. Evelyn moved through the house by the pale light from the kitchen, her emergency lantern ready on the counter. Max paced anxiously from window to door, whining low in his throat. Suddenly, above the storm's roar, she heard barking. Not Max. This was high-pitched and desperate, carrying across the yards from somewhere nearby. Evelyn's heart raced. She recognized the sound. It was the neighbor's dog, a little terrier named Buddy, but she also heard something else. A child's cry, faint and scared, barely audible over the wind. Evelyn's instincts kicked in. She grabbed her raincoat, pulled on her boots, and called to Max. "Stay close, boy. Let's go." They pushed into the tempest, wind lashing at their faces. Water pooled across the sidewalk and yard, rising fast, turning the street into a shallow river. The neighbor's house stood just 2 doors down, but the journey felt endless. Evelyn slipped and stumbled, her heart pounding from exertion and fear, Max circling protectively, barking at the thunder as if to chase it away. When they reached the porch, she saw that the door was half open, the bottom already slick with water. Inside, the lights had gone out. "Hello?" she called, voice trembling. "Anyone there?" "Help!" A child's voice called back somewhere inside the darkness. Evelyn's heart squeezed. She waded into the house, Max pressing close behind her, flashlight beam cutting through the murky gloom. In the living room, water lapped at the furniture. Buddy the terrier stood on the sofa, barking furiously at the rising flood. Evelyn spotted the little boy, maybe 6 or 7, clinging to the banister at the foot of the staircase, eyes wide with terror. "It's okay," Evelyn called, forcing her voice to be strong. "We're here. Don't let go." But as she stepped forward, a piece of floating debris slammed into her leg, nearly knocking her down. Her chest burned, the familiar pain creeping up her left arm. She gritted her teeth and pressed on, Max pushing ahead, swimming through the water as it reached his shoulders. Max reached the boy first, letting out a reassuring bark. The child sobbed and grabbed for Max's collar. Evelyn reached them just as the water crested the 3rd step. "Put your arms around Max," she told the boy, "and hold on tight." Max seemed to understand. He braced himself and guided the child through the water, paws churning, keeping the boy's head above the rising tide. Evelyn followed, half wading, half swimming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pushed the sofa closer to the door, creating a floating bridge, and together they fought their way back to the porch. Outside, neighbors had gathered, some shouting instructions, others filming the scene on their phones. The wind was still wild, rain lashing sideways, but someone rushed forward and grabbed the boy, wrapping him in a blanket. Buddy was scooped up and carried to safety. Evelyn leaned against the porch railing, chest heaving, vision swimming with exhaustion. Max pressed his head into her leg, trembling, eyes searching her face for reassurance. "Good boy," she whispered, stroking his soaked fur with shaking hands. "You saved him, Max. You saved us all." Then, just as she tried to stand, her heart stuttered, sharp and cold, like a fist squeezing from the inside. The world tilted, sounds faded, and she crumpled onto the porch, gasping for air. People rushed forward, someone shouting for an ambulance, hands lifting her gently as the world spun and dimmed. When Evelyn opened her eyes again, it was to the pale fluorescence of a hospital room. The first thing she saw was Max curled up on the floor beside her bed, tail thumping weakly against the linoleum. The nurse smiled. "He never left your side. Neither did your neighbors. They're calling you and Max heroes." News of the rescue swept through the community and across the local news. Footage of Max guiding the child to safety aired on television and flooded social media, painting Evelyn and her loyal dog as symbols of bravery. But as accolades poured in, new concerns followed. Reporters and social workers began to question whether Evelyn, with her health scares and advancing age, could continue caring for Max. Her son, Brian, looked at her with a mixture of pride and worry, knowing the storm had changed everything again. But in that quiet hospital room, with Max's head on her lap and the storm finally past, Evelyn felt a new kind of peace, a sense that, together, they had faced the worst the world could throw at them and survived. Sunlight crept through the hospital blinds, spilling over Evelyn's bed in soft golden bars. She watched the dust motes drift and thought for the 1,000th time about how quickly a life could turn. One moment she was cradling Max on the porch, the world reduced to the sound of storm and the beat of her own frantic heart. The next, she was flat on her back, wires and beeping machines tracking the stubborn rhythm of a heart that refused to quit, but didn't always cooperate either. Max was there for every moment of her recovery, refusing to be led away even when staff gently coaxed. He lay at the foot of her bed, eyes fixed on her face, rising only to drink or to nudge her hand for reassurance. The nurses, many of them dog lovers themselves, bent the rules, sneaking him extra time, sharing photos with the other patients. He became the hospital's unofficial mascot, and word of their ordeal continued to spread. But as the days passed and the news cycle faded, new worries replaced old ones. Brian visited every day, bringing fresh flowers, her favorite books, and a cloud of anxiety he tried to hide. Sometimes he'd pace the hallway, murmuring into his phone, his brows drawn in concern. "Mom," he said one afternoon, sitting on the edge of her bed, voice soft but steady. "I know you love Max, but you scared all of us. What if something happens again? What if you're home alone?" He hesitated, then added, "Social services has been in touch. The shelter director, too. They want to know if you're up for this, if Max is safe with you, and if you're safe with him." Evelyn listened, silent. The words stung, but she understood their fear. The rescue had drawn attention from all sides, news outlets, neighbors, even strangers who'd seen the story online. But attention brought questions. Could a woman her age, with her health problems, really take care of a dog as big and unpredictable as Max? Was it fair to either of them? As if sensing her turmoil, Max climbed up, gently pressing his head into her lap. She stroked his ears, letting the silence speak for her, feeling the old ache of loss and the new, sharper pain of being doubted. She remembered the helplessness after her husband's death, the emptiness that only Max's return had filled. She wasn't ready to lose him, not again. That evening, Dr. Lee called from the shelter. "Evelyn, I know it feels unfair, but the county has rules. They'll do a home visit. They'll talk to your doctor, maybe ask for letters from neighbors. This is just what happens after stories like yours go public. We're on your side, but you might have to fight for Max." Evelyn nodded, jaw set. "I've never been afraid of a fight," she said quietly. "Not when it matters." Still, the stress weighed on her. She could see it in Max, too. He was skittish, more withdrawn than before, flinching at sudden sounds, pacing the house at night. Sometimes he'd curl up by the front door as if waiting for someone to come take him away. Other times he'd refuse his food, turning away with mournful eyes. Evelyn tried to keep their routine steady. She wrote letters to her neighbors explaining the situation, asking for their support. She called her old friends from the shelter, who promised to speak on her behalf. "You're the best thing that ever happened to that dog," one volunteer said, voice thick with emotion. "We all know it." Still, doubt crept in. Evelyn caught herself moving slower, second-guessing her strength, watching Max with a worried eye. At night, when sleep wouldn't come, she'd remember the storm, the surge of water, the boy's terrified face, and wonder if maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was being selfish, holding on to something she couldn't manage anymore. But then came a knock at her door one morning, a quiet tap, then the sound of voices outside. Evelyn opened it to find a crowd on her porch. Neighbors she'd known for years, people from the shelter, even the mail carrier stood in the sunlight, holding a stack of papers and a homemade sign that read, "Let Evelyn and Max stay together." A young woman stepped forward, eyes shining. "We started a petition, Miss Carter. Over 200 signatures. You're not alone in this. We're all behind you." Someone passed her a casserole, another offered to walk Max, and a retired teacher pressed an envelope into her hand. "For vet bills or whatever you need." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. The support wasn't just in words. It was in action, in the community that had grown around her and Max without her even realizing it. That night, for the first time in days, she slept soundly. Max curled close, his breathing slow and steady. The following week, the social worker arrived. She toured the house, asked careful questions, met Max, and listened as neighbors and friends came by to speak on Evelyn's behalf. The official remained non-committal, but as she left, she paused. "You have quite a support system here," she said with a smile. "It's rare, you know. People usually face these challenges alone." Afterward, Brian sat on the porch with Evelyn, the sun setting in bands of gold and pink. He squeezed her hand, his voice thick with feeling. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't want to lose you. Or him. But I see it now. You need each other. And all these people, too." Evelyn hugged him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "We're stronger together," she whispered. "That's what Max taught me. That's what all of you have shown me." And inside, Max barked softly, as if in agreement, his eyes bright and hopeful once more. Spring moved uncertainly through the Oregon Valley, teasing the town with soft breezes and sudden cold snaps. Daffodils bloomed beneath Evelyn's front windows, hopeful yellow faces nodding in the rain. Inside, the house felt both safer and more fragile, as if happiness could slip away at the slightest misstep. Evelyn clung fiercely to her routine with Max, treasuring every small moment. Each day began with their slow walk around the block, Max's leash looped securely around Evelyn's wrist. They'd pause at the community garden, where neighbors often stopped to chat or slip Max a biscuit. Children would wave and shout, "That's the hero dog," while elderly neighbors nodded with approval. It was more than just a walk. It was proof that, despite everything, life was returning to something close to normal. But trouble, Evelyn knew, rarely disappeared completely. It simply changed shape. Brian's car showed up more often now, the old blue Ford parking out front every other afternoon. He'd come in, arms full of groceries or paperwork, and set about tidying the kitchen, refilling Evelyn's pill containers, and frowning at any sign of fatigue. Sometimes he'd sit on the porch, staring at the horizon, as if searching for answers in the drifting clouds. One gray Saturday, as Max and Evelyn returned from their walk, Brian met them at the gate, his expression tight. "We need to talk, Mom," he said, and led her inside. Max followed, tail low, sensing the tension. Brian closed the door and turned to face his mother, voice trembling. "I've been thinking about what happened. The storm, the hospital. You could have died, Mom. And what would have happened to Max? Or if he panicked and bit someone?" Evelyn bristled, straightening her shoulders. "Brian, I appreciate your concern. But Max and we've come this far together. I'm not giving him up, not after everything." Brian shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "You say that. But what about next time? I'm not trying to be the bad guy. His voice broke. "I just can't lose you, Mom." The silence in the room pressed down like a weight. Max paced in anxious circles, ears flat, nose pressed to Evelyn's knee. Seeing her son's distress, Evelyn's anger softened. "Brian," she said gently, "I know you're worried. But Max is family. He's part of my life, my healing. I can't let fear take him away again." Brian's jaw worked. torn between frustration and love. Then let me take Max for a while. Just until you're stronger, please. The words landed like a blow. For a moment Evelyn said nothing, staring at her hands, her heart pounding with dread. Max, sensing the shift, whimpered softly, tail tucked. Evelyn looked down and reached for his head, stroking his fur. No, she said firmly. He stays with me. Brian's face darkened. I can't just stand by, Mom. If you won't do what's best, maybe I have to. The tension broke like a snapped string. Max, overwhelmed by the rising voices and raw emotion, bolted for the door, pushing it open with his shoulder and vanishing down the steps. Max! Evelyn cried, scrambling to her feet, ignoring the pain in her hip. She hurried after him, but Brian caught her arm. Stop! I'll get him, he said, voice tight with guilt. But Evelyn pulled free, her mind racing with fear. The two of them chased Max down the street, calling his name, hearts in their throats. He ran blindly, fear and confusion propelling him through yards and across the busy main road. Tires screeched, horns blared. Then, a sickening thud. Max's body tumbled onto the asphalt, legs splayed. A car stopped in the crosswalk. For one awful moment, everything went silent. Then chaos. A crowd gathered, voices rose in panic, and Evelyn staggered to Max's side, Brian right behind her. She knelt in the road, hands trembling as she checked for signs of life. Max's chest rose and fell, shallow and quick, his eyes flickering open. Blood stained his fur near his back leg, and he whimpered, trying to move. Don't, baby, don't move, Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. Help's coming, hold on. The animal control van arrived within minutes, sirens wailing. Brian flagged them down, his own hands shaking, face ashen. Volunteers helped lift Max gently onto a stretcher, rushing him to the vet hospital just outside of town. Evelyn insisted on riding in the back, clutching Max's paw the whole way. The vet's office was a blur of white coats and urgent voices. Max was whisked into surgery as Evelyn and Brian waited, silent, hope and terror wrestling in their eyes. The night crept in, hours stretching impossibly long. Brian sat beside his mother, guilt etched deep in the lines of his face. I'm so sorry, Mom, he choked out at last. I never meant. Evelyn shook her head, too tired for blame. We both wanted to protect each other, she murmured. That's all either of us did. She spent the night in a hard plastic chair, watching the door, praying for a miracle. Each time a vet or nurse passed, she looked up, her heart rising, then sinking again. Dawn finally broke, painting the sky outside in pale pink and gold. Dr. Lee appeared, her face grave, but not without hope. Max survived, she announced softly. He's stable, but he has a long recovery ahead. We'll need to work together to help him heal. Relief swept through Evelyn, weak and overwhelming. She leaned on Brian, both of them crying, grateful for the second chance. She promised herself she wouldn't waste it, not this time. For the first time, Brian seemed to understand. We'll figure it out, Mom. Together, I promise. Evelyn nodded, her gaze never leaving the door that separated her from Max. She knew the road ahead would be hard, physically, emotionally, for all of them. But in her heart, she felt a stubborn, rising hope. Love, she realized, wasn't about holding on perfectly. Sometimes it meant losing, hurting, and finding your way back, no matter how broken you felt. Sometimes it meant fighting for what mattered, again and again. Max had taught her that, and she was determined to teach it back. The days following Max's accident unfolded with an intensity that felt both urgent and strangely comforting. For Evelyn, time became a blur of waiting rooms, whispered updates, and hopeful glances at the vet's closed doors. She kept vigil beside Max's kennel at the animal hospital whenever they would let her, her chair drawn close, knitting in her lap, eyes never leaving his sleeping form. The staff grew used to her presence, her quiet encouragement, the soft murmur of her voice telling Max about the garden, about spring, about all the things they'd do together once he was home. Max's recovery was slow. He came out of surgery with a splint on his hind leg and a shaved patch of fur along his ribs. There were days when he barely stirred, pain etched deep in his tired eyes. But whenever Evelyn was near, he seemed to rally, his nose twitching, tail thumping weakly when she spoke. It became clear to everyone, staff, volunteers, even other patients, that something powerful tied this battered old dog and the silver-haired woman together, something beyond simple ownership. But Evelyn wasn't alone in her vigil. The community rallied around her and Max in ways she could never have imagined. The local vet, Dr. Carter, no relation, waived the cost of Max's surgery and follow-up care, saying only, "You two have given this town something to root for. It's the least I can do." Volunteers from the shelter took shifts with Max so Evelyn could rest. They brought her meals, offered rides, and kept her company in the late hours when the worry became too much. At home, neighbors organized a meal train. Dinners appeared at Evelyn's door: casseroles, homemade bread, fresh fruit. Someone mowed her lawn. Another fixed the fence that had sagged after the storm. Letters and cards flooded in from people she barely knew. Children from the elementary school drew pictures of the brave dog and his lady, taping them to her mailbox or delivering them in person, faces shy and eager. Brian, humbled and deeply moved, visited every day. He helped Evelyn with errands, fielded calls from social workers and reporters, and, most importantly, sat with Max, gently stroking his fur and murmuring apologies. It was in these moments that Brian began to see not just the burden, but the gift of his mother's stubborn love. Watching her, he realized that healing was never a solo act. It was the patient work of many hands and many hearts. Slowly, Max regained his strength. At first, he could only hobble from his bed to the door, his movements awkward but determined. But the more visitors he received, the more encouragement he heard, the stronger he became. Neighbors would drop by the vet clinic with treats or just a kind word. The mail carrier, who had never owned a pet, began bringing Max his favorite biscuits every morning, setting them gently on the counter and giving him a scratch behind the ears. Then, one sunny morning, Dr. Lee from the shelter arrived with a special request. "Evelyn, I've had an idea," she said, smiling. "Max has always been gentle with people, especially the older folks. What if we gave him a new job, just a few hours a week, visiting the senior center? The residents could use a friend. And I think Max could too." Evelyn hesitated, concern flickering across her face. "He's still healing, Dr. Lee. He might not be ready." Dr. Lee squeezed her hand. "He doesn't have to do much. Just be himself, if you're willing, of course." They started small. Once a week, Evelyn and Max, his legs still splinted but his eyes bright, visited the senior center just across town. The effect was immediate and remarkable. Residents lit up at the sight of Max, calling out his name, sharing stories of dogs they'd loved and lost. Max, patient and gentle, let trembling hands stroke his fur. One woman, nearly blind, wept quietly as she held Max's head in her lap. "It's like he knows," she whispered, "how lonely it gets." Words spread quickly. Soon, other volunteers joined in, bringing their own dogs, organizing therapy pet days. The senior center buzzed with new life. And Max, once a stray and a survivor, became a symbol of resilience and hope. Evelyn found her own healing in this new rhythm. She made friends among the residents, swapping recipes and stories, discovering a community she never knew she'd needed. Brian, seeing his mother's transformation, began to help at the center too, reading aloud to the group or simply sharing coffee with other families. The Carter home, once so quiet, now overflowed with visitors, neighbors stopping in with flowers, shelter volunteers laughing in the kitchen, children playing with Max in the backyard as his limp faded, day by day. One afternoon, Evelyn found herself at the kitchen table with Dr. Lee sipping tea while Max dozed in a patch of sunlight. "I spent so many years thinking I was alone," Evelyn said quietly. "But I see now. I was always surrounded by people who cared. I just needed to let them in." Dr. Lee smiled. "That's the hardest part, sometimes. Asking for help. Letting yourself be seen." Evelyn nodded, tears in her eyes. Not of sadness, but gratitude. She looked at Max, at the signs of life blooming all around her, and felt something deep and old settle inside her. A sense of belonging, a trust in the kindness of strangers, and in the loyalty of one remarkable dog. Max stirred, lifting his head, as if he could sense her contentment. He limped to her side, resting his muzzle in her lap. Evelyn stroked his ears and whispered, "We're not alone anymore, Max. We never really were." And for the first time since her husband's passing, Evelyn felt that the future, whatever it might bring, was something to look forward to, not fear. Late spring sunlight filtered through lace curtains, painting warm patterns across Evelyn's kitchen table. The house, once haunted by silence, now hummed with the low, gentle rhythms of daily life. A kettle whistling, a bird tapping at the window, Max's contented snoring on the braided rug near her feet. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt a steadiness inside her, like her heart had finally found a place to rest. She sat at the table, a blank sheet of paper before her, pen poised in her hand. She had not written a letter to her late husband Bill in a long time. The habit had faded with her grief, lost in the scramble of old pain and new responsibilities. But today, with the air full of promise and Max's head warm against her toes, she felt the urge to speak to him once more, to make sense of the journey she'd traveled since losing him. She started with a simple greeting, the way she always had. "Dear Bill," she wrote, smiling at the memory of his crooked grin, the warmth of his steady hands. "It's been a season of storms, outside and inside. But I think maybe I'm starting to understand what it all means." Her pen moved slowly at first, but soon the words flowed, honest and unguarded. She wrote about Max, how he'd returned to her life battered and scared, how their struggles mirrored each other's in ways she'd never expected. She wrote of the nights spent by his side in the shelter, the quiet understanding in his eyes, the way he'd leaned into her touch as if he remembered every moment of their past together. She wrote of Brian and the hard conversations, the fear of losing not just a dog but a family, and the slow, painful process of learning to trust again. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote about the rescue, the storm, the water rising, the terror in that little boy's voice. She remembered Max braving the flood, guiding the child to safety, risking everything despite his own fear. She remembered collapsing on the porch, believing it was the end, and waking in the hospital to find Max curled faithfully at her side. But as she wrote, Evelyn realized the real lessons had not come from the grand, heroic moments. They'd come from the small, persistent acts of hope. Getting out of bed each morning, taking Max for a walk even when her body ached, accepting soup from a neighbor, letting Brian hold her hand in the waiting room. It was in these ordinary acts, these stubborn acts of hope, as she called them, that her healing had truly begun. "Resilience," she wrote, "isn't something we find all at once in a single burst of courage. It's built day by day, moment by moment. It's waking up after heartbreak and trying again. It's letting others in when you want to close the door. It's loving again, even when it hurts." Evelyn paused, watching Max stretch and yawn. His fur was growing back where it had been shaved, his limp almost gone. He'd become a fixture at the senior center, lying at the feet of lonely residents, bringing a spark to their tired eyes. Sometimes Evelyn would see her own journey reflected in those visits, the slow thawing of isolation, the way a single touch or kind word could open a door inside someone who thought they'd been forgotten. She wrote of the community, the neighbors, the volunteers, the children whose drawings now covered her refrigerator. She wrote about belonging and how she'd always thought it meant having someone to care for, but now realized it was as much about letting herself be cared for in return. Healing, she wrote, is not about forgetting the pain or pretending it never happened. It's about carrying it forward with tenderness, letting it teach us to be gentler with ourselves and with others. "The scars I carry on my body and my heart are not signs of weakness. They are reminders that I survived, that I loved, that I kept going." She looked around her little kitchen, at the faded curtains Bill had picked out, the chipped mug she used every morning, the patch of sunlight where Max always napped. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a good life, a life rebuilt from broken pieces, stronger for all it had endured. Her letter grew quieter, more reflective. "Belonging," she wrote, "isn't just about family by blood. It's family by choice, by kindness, by the small ways we show up for each other." I thought I was alone, but all along I was surrounded by a community willing to help if only I let them in. She wrote about letting go. Letting go is the hardest lesson of all. I used to think it meant abandoning love, but I see now it means passing it forward, making space for new hope, new connections. I'll never stop missing you, Bill. But loving Max and being loved in return has taught me that love is not finite. It grows. It changes shape. It survives the worst of storms. She set the pen down, tears glistening in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of gratitude and hard-won peace. She felt Max nudge her knee, as if sensing the shift inside her, and she reached down to ruffle his ears. "Thank you, old friend," she whispered, "for coming home." She walked out to the porch, letter in hand, Max following close behind. The world outside was green and blooming, the air thick with birdsong. Evelyn breathed deeply, savoring the richness of the moment. She pressed the letter to her chest, a silent promise to herself and to Bill, to keep living, keep loving, keep hoping, no matter what. As she sat with Max at her feet, hand resting on his graying head, Evelyn felt a peace she thought she'd lost forever, a quiet assurance that home was not a place but a feeling, a community, a dog at her side and a heart still open to the world. Spring ripened into early summer, painting Evelyn's backyard in a wash of green and gold. The last of the storms had faded, leaving behind a world that seemed somehow brighter, scrubbed clean and full of promise. In every corner of her little house, there was evidence of renewal. Potted herbs on the windowsill, the faint scent of lemon and rosemary in the kitchen, laughter drifting in from the porch where neighbors had gathered for an afternoon potluck. Today, the house overflowed with life. Friends from the shelter arrived carrying bowls of salad and plates of cookies. The mail carrier set a bouquet of wildflowers on the counter before taking a seat with the others. Children ran through the grass, shrieking with delight as they chased each other around the garden beds. Brian had fired up the old grill, flipping burgers and grinning at his mother's attempts to shoo him away from her signature potato salad. In the center of it all was Max, healed and whole, his coat glossy in the sun. He moved with a new kind of energy, greeting every guest with a wag and a gentle nose, accepting hugs from children and head scratches from the elderly. No trace remained of the battered stray he had once been. Now he was the heart of the home, a gentle guardian, a reason for people to linger just a little longer. Evelyn watched it all from the shade of her back porch, her heart swollen with pride and a soft, unshakable happiness. She sat with her cup of tea, Max sprawled at her feet, and took it all in, the chatter, the easy affection, the way strangers and friends blended into something like family. The volunteers from the animal shelter brought stories and jokes, recalling the day Max had returned to Evelyn, the way the whole town had followed their journey. "You know," Dr. Lee said, raising her glass, "I think Max did more to bring this community together than any of us could have managed. He's a hero, and so are you, Evelyn." Evelyn laughed, a bright, ringing sound that surprised even her. "I think Max just reminded us all what it means to belong," she replied, "and what it means to be brave, even when you're scared." Children gathered on a blanket in the grass, giggling as Max flopped beside them, rolling onto his back for belly rubs. One little girl pressed her cheek to his side, whispering secrets into his fur. An older man, a newcomer to the neighborhood, sat quietly nearby, smiling at the sight. "It's good to see a place where people still look out for each other," he said to Evelyn, voice warm with nostalgia. "It's rare these days." Evelyn nodded. "It is, but it's something we can choose every day. I think I forgot that for a while." Brian came to sit beside her, handing her a plate loaded with food. He leaned back, surveying the scene with satisfaction. "You did it, Mom," he said softly. "You made it through." She smiled, reaching for his hand. "We did it, all of us. Max, too." For a long moment they sat in companionable silence, watching the play of light and shadow, the movement of people who, once strangers, had become something so much more. Evelyn thought about all they'd survived, the loneliness, the fear, the losses and mistakes. None of it had been easy, but every hardship had left something behind, a lesson, a new friend, a deeper understanding of what it meant to love and to be loved. As the afternoon faded into evening, someone brought out a cake, homemade, slightly lopsided, with "Welcome Home" scrawled in bright blue icing. The crowd gathered, singing and clapping, their voices rising in a chorus of warmth. Max sat at Evelyn's feet, tail wagging as children fed him bites of cake, their laughter echoing against the fence. Later, as dusk fell and the guests trickled away, Evelyn lingered in the garden, the sky painted in streaks of lavender and gold. Brian helped her gather the last of the plates, then kissed her forehead before heading home. "Call me if you need anything," he said. "I mean it, Mom. Anything at all." "I will," Evelyn promised. "But I think I'm going to be just fine." The house emptied, but it was not empty. It was full of memory and joy, of voices and laughter that lingered long after the doors closed. Max followed her inside, his nails clicking on the old wood floors, before settling at her feet as she made a pot of tea. She sat by the window, gazing out at the soft, deepening twilight. The garden glowed faintly, fireflies blinking among the hollyhocks and phlox. The world felt large again, but no longer lonely. Evelyn reflected on what she had learned, her thoughts drifting like music through the gentle hush. Redemption is possible at any age, she realized. Not in grand gestures, but in the small, patient acts of love and kindness that stitch a life back together. Love, once thought lost, can return in the most unexpected forms. A stray dog, a helping hand, a neighbor's knock at the door. You just have to be brave enough to open that door, to risk belonging again. True family and community, she thought, grow from acts of compassion, especially toward the vulnerable. Whether a forgotten dog or a lonely human heart, what mattered most wasn't how many times you fell, but how many times you found the courage to get back up, to reach out, to forgive, to try again. "We are most human," Evelyn whispered, "not in moments of triumph, but in the daily practice of patience, forgiveness, and kindness." She looked down at Max, who had dozed off at her feet, his breathing slow and steady. She ran her fingers through his fur, smiling at the deep sense of belonging that radiated between them. A belonging not of blood, but of shared journey, of wounds healed and hopes renewed. Caring for another, animal or person, was never a burden, she realized. It was a path to meaning and belonging, a gift that grew larger every time it was shared. The world was quiet now, the only sound the soft hum of the summer night. Evelyn felt peace settle in her bones, a peace she hadn't known in years. In the hush, she leaned toward Max, her voice barely a whisper. "We're home," she said, and she knew it was true. Not just for herself and not just for Max, but for everyone who had dared to care, to hope, and to love.